Hi, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Schmidt. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about how we are going to write our speeches for our Living History Museum. So what I'm going to be doing is showing you how I'm going to write my own speech. This is just a little demonstration. I'm choosing to write my own speech about a guy named Steve Jobs. And he's a great guy. He did a lot for technology. And I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to just take a look together and write a speech together. Are you ready? Here we go. Okay, boys and girls, this is a slideshow that we've created for you that you're going to be able to see on your learning slide. So when you go in to see your homework, you're not just going to see this video that I created for you, you're also going to be seeing this slideshow underneath it. And you'll be able to look through the slideshow anytime that you would like. And it talks about all the information that you're going to need to do your biography speech. You can feel free to add props when you're ready to present. You can also feel free to dress up in a costume. We're going to try to keep our speeches at about 2 minutes, but if they're less than that, that's okay. So let's proceed, shall we? Okay, here we go. By the way, Mrs. Long and her son Dylan worked a really long time on this presentation for you so that it would go really smoothly when we videotape. Now, kiddos, the first thing that we want to do when we are writing a speech is really similar to the first thing we're doing when we write a paper. So I want you to think back to your biography papers that you wrote a couple weeks ago before we had to stay home to stay healthy. And I want you to think about the fact that we like to hook our reader. And when we hook our reader, we use a question or a quote or some sort of an interesting fact to really draw interest to our writing. And that's the same thing we would do with our speech. And I told you that I'm doing my speech on a guy named Steve Jobs, who's a computer designer and also helped with the iPhone. So my question that I'm using to hook my reader is showing up right now in yellow. Have you checked your phone lately? If you do, you have me to thank for that. Now, that's not me, Mrs. Schmidt. As I'm writing this speech, I'm pretending that I am my famous person. So I'm going to pretend that I am Steve Jobs, a famous technology wizard and designer for Apple. So as you see the yellow writing, you'll see that I am the one that's doing that writing, and those are actually my speech sentences that I'm preparing so that I can read those off and present my speech to my class. So let's keep going. I've got my hook. The next thing that we were trying to do with our biographies was to introduce our famous person a little bit, their name, their date of birth, where they were born, their birthplace, and maybe a little bit of what they were famous for. I'm choosing not to put the date of death right at the beginning of my speech. I'm going to put it at the end of my speech, but your speech may be a little different than mine, and that is okay. So let's take a look. This is the sentence that I chose to write. Hi, I'm Steve Jobs. I was an inventor, businessman, and one of the designers of the iPhone. I was born on February 22nd, 1955. I was adopted and raised in Mountain View, California. So I just chose a couple of sentences that I knew about Steve Jobs, and I included those at the beginning to introduce myself. The next thing you're going to want to include in your speech is a little bit of information about the early life, childhood, and family of your famous person. Now, these prompts should be feeling pretty familiar to you because if you'll remember a few weeks back, we were actually working on these as chapters in our book. So I know you've done all the research for a lot of this already, and that you've also done a lot of the reading. If you need to go back and read some more and get more information, you have plenty of time to do that. We do not expect you to sit down and write your speech in one sitting. We are hoping you'll spend the whole week this week working on your speech. So here's what I wrote about Steve Jobs. I was often in the garage working with my dad on electronics. My dad showed me how to take apart and reconstruct electronics. Now, boys and girls, that's something that he did as a child and really enjoyed with his adopted father. The next thing that you're going to want to look at is their education, formal and informal education. Now, as I was learning about Steve Jobs and reading his biographies, I noted that he didn't really like school much. He didn't like formal school. He liked to learn and he was interested in learning. But Formal school was not his favorite thing. In fact, after high school, he went to college, but he chose to drop out of college. And he really, really still enjoyed the technical classes or creative classes that he would attend, actually. And one of his favorite classes that he remembers attending was calligraphy, which is the art of writing and doing really fancy handwriting. So what I chose to write for my sentence was, I went to school, but I didn't like it too much. In fact, I quit attending regular class in college and chose to only attend creative classes. I love calligraphy. And so I was just choosing a few things from each of my areas of research that I want to include in my speech. We do not have to include all of the things that we would include in our book, in our speech. So let's keep going. Who influenced Steve Jobs? Well, I definitely know a couple people that influenced him. He did work on electronics later on in his life. And so we know that his dad definitely influenced him with his electronics, but he also made a friend. Steve Wozniak became a friend of his and a fellow computer designer with him. They both loved to work with computer chips, which is a technology that at the time when they met, not a lot of people knew about. And so they were very excited to find a friend that not only did they get along with, but who agreed on the uses of computer chips. And so those were a couple of the folks that really influenced Steve Jobs in his life, in his early life, in fact. So here we go. We'll go ahead and hop into the next slide. For some reason, all of my writing is coming up on the next slide. So I think what I'm going to do is just highlight what I'm going to be talking to you about. The first thing that I want you to be thinking about are your accomplishments, what your famous person was famous for. And so what I did is read up on some of the things that Steve Jobs did to become a famous person. His first job after he dropped out of college was to design video games for Atari. Now, kiddos, Atari is an old video game company, but they created some video games that have lasted and still are remembered, including Pac-Man. So he created some video games, not Pac-Man, but for that company. And then he started his own computer company with Steve, his friend, in the garage of his parents' home. In order to start that company and to have money, they had to sell things that they really loved. They sold a van. Well, Steve sold his VW van, and Steve and his partner sold his. He sold a scientific computer that really helped him to solve math problems, complex math problems. So they both sold something that they really loved and used quite a bit. Now, kiddos, once they did that, they started the Apple Computer Company. They designed user-friendly computers, and they sold a lot of those user-friendly computers because back when they were designing computers were fairly large, they took up huge amounts of spaces, and they were very difficult to use. And their idea was to not only design a computer that looked attractive and looked really nice, and they used to design computers, Apple computers that were in different candy colors, actually, so they looked really good on your desk, but also that worked really quickly and pulled things up really quickly and were user-friendly. In the meantime, as he was working with Apple, he also bought Pixar Animation Studios, which was a very, very small animation studio at the time when he purchased it. But while he owned it, they produced some movies that you may have heard of: Toy Story, Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles. After he worked at Pixar for a little while, he went back to Apple to work a little bit more. And it was during his second round with Apple that he moved into trying to create a computer that you could hold in your hands and take around with you, which was the iPhone. So not only did he help to design the first iPhone, but also a lot of the new iPhone models that came out after that. Then I went into some interesting and fun facts, which are a lot of fun to look up. When he was a teenager, he was really interested in Buddhism. He actually went to a different country during his college years and studied Buddhism. He also was sort of a guy that liked to wear the same clothes every day: black turtleneck, jeans, sneakers. He did go to college, as we mentioned earlier, but then he took a break. Now, kiddos, the reason that I picked Steve Jobs, the reason that I remembered him during this particular time is because I was thinking about how much he has done to help us to communicate while we're all stuck at home. He really did a lot to help people to be able to communicate with each other from far away. Right now, I'm far away from my mom and my dad and my aunts and uncles and grandparents, and I know that you are too. And so isn't it nice to have technology that we can be using to keep in touch with people while we all stay home and stay healthy? And then the last thing that we want you to do is to think of some sort of a quote that you want to share about your famous person. His quote was that he does not have faith in technology. He has faith in people. So that was the quote that I chose for him. I would like to end my speech by adding that sadly he died of a aggressive form of cancer when he was just 56 years old on October 5th, 2011. Now, kiddos, this is how I chose to write my speech. And now that I have my speech written, I'm going to use just the parts that were written, which are highlighted in yellow, as you can see, and I'm going to practice that speech and just read those parts and not the blue parts. And then once I feel really confident getting ready to do my speech, I will be ready to share my speech with others, maybe with my parents or with my brothers and sisters, maybe with my dog at home. And that's when I will be able to share my speech. So that's it. That's how I wrote my speech today. And if you were in my classroom and we were not staying home and staying healthy, then you would actually have done a lesson very similar to this with Mrs. Freiberger, with Mrs. Long, with Ms. Graff, and you would have learned a lot about how to write your speech. But since we couldn't do that, we had to do the video. So boys and girls, I hope that that helps. And I hope that you can look back at this when you need to as you're writing your own speech. And if you'll want to take a look out for me, I will be dressed as Steve Jobs in that black turtleneck and those glasses and that blue jean outfit. And I will be giving you my speech, just the yellow parts that I wrote with you today on this video. And I will be showing you how it might look when you actually give your speech. So I hope that that helps. And thank you so much for joining me today.